And therefore, history was mostly about one class of people. But there were lots of people who were left out of those histories. And over time, many historians have worked to fill in those gaps, to give a better understanding of the fullness of our American history. And yet, that has also left a gap, which is the whole story updated. So Jill has taken it upon herself to do something about that. And this month, she will be publishing this book, These Truths. It's probably the most sweeping and ambitious single-volume history of America that has been written in many, many decades. With footnotes, it clocks in at about 900 pages. It is scholarship of the highest order, and it is beautifully written. I have not yet read all 900 pages, I will acknowledge that. But it tells the story of America in all the richness that it deserves. Her colleague Jim Kloppenberg, who I think is here tonight somewhere, who's himself a distinguished historian here at Harvard and is at work on his own history of the democratic tradition in America, said of Jill's book when I asked him about it, that it, quote, marks a notable attempt to reanimate what was once, more than half a century ago, a vibrant tradition of historical scholarship, the attempt to explain to the citizenry how our present emerged from our past. The phrase, these truths, comes from Jefferson. Jill will no doubt talk much more about that, and refers to America's founding principles: political equality, natural rights, the sovereignty of the people. And the question posed ever since, as Professor Lepore puts it, is, quote, does American history prove these truths or belie them? As she writes at the conclusion of her introduction, the past is an inheritance, a gift, and a burden. It cannot be shirked. You carry it everywhere. There's nothing for it but to get to know it. Which brings me to tonight. We are at the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School of Government in the heat of a political season. In a matter of weeks, less than 2 months, we will have midterm elections that could change the balance of power in Washington. It affect the course of the Trump administration, obviously, and perhaps the country as a whole. Throughout the fall and winter, the Institute of Politics will be looking at many aspects of what these midterms are involving, and then beyond that, what 2020 may hold. We'll be looking this fall at battles by the district or by the state, at the candidates, the money, the ads, the strategies, the forces at work. But we are at more than just the final weeks of a pivotal election. We are at a moment in our history that every citizen is trying to understand. We know that what we are going through as a country is something different. We don't know how this chapter of history is going to end, and we are also looking for some greater understanding of how this moment fits into the history of the nation that has known many divisions before. And so we turn to Professor Lepore to help explain the present by helping us to understand the past. It's with great pleasure that I now turn the evening over to our distinguished speaker. Please welcome Professor Lepore to the stage.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks very much for that introduction, which I'm just deeply honored by and humbled by. And thanks, Jim Kloppenberg, for those lovely words about my new book. It's a thrill to be here with all of you this evening. I have a kind of difficult charge, which is to kind of kick off the year, which will be focusing necessarily on midterms, minute by minute, by taking you back to, not to the midterms, but to the Middle Ages, trying to give you a large, sweeping account of American history in a very short period of time. But I want us to start. I'm going to start you in the president. We'll come back to the president at the end. I know our Q&A will cover a range of questions and topics. But in the short time I have this evening, I wanted to give you a glimpse of really the richness of the American past and the resonances that are to be found by diving into that past. Sort of what I think of this book as trying to do, and this evening really is trying to do, we're all kind of stuck in the shallows. I'm trying to drag us all out into the depths, and we just have to be willing to dive down and forget about those shallows for a little while. So I want to begin by remarking that the political conversation that we are in the midst of here is fundamentally a conversation about the relationship between the past and the future. Each political slogan that you will hear, are hearing day in and day out, has this quality of very concisely making a historical argument. These slogans and posters and campaigns tend to collapse the distance between the past and the future, to just smash it all together, to juxtapose the past and the future in some very weird and unsettling ways that I think are part of the disequilibrium that many of us feel about this moment in contemporary politics. There are all kinds of invocations as if we have been and are continuing to be in the middle of a strain between a group of people who want to pull us into the present and people who want to pull us to the past. Which leaves, I think, many of us sympathizing with the guy who carried this poster of the great Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. This speaks to me all these years later. So, my claim then is that the turmoil we are in is not unrelated to an inability to focus clearly on the past, and in particular, to measure the distance across time. This flattening of the past, these shallow waters that we seem to be stuck in, I think are quite perilous to our ability to make good decisions. So I'm going to take us back, as I said, nearly back to the Middle Ages. What I'm going to do is take you on a quick tour of a bunch of representations of the world, and in particular representations of America. Before America was known to Europeans, this was the first map of the world. It's the first printed map of the world. It was drawn in the 7th century, but after printing emerged in the 15th century, the first map of the world that was printed is this map known as the TO map that has east on the bottom, divides the world into 3 parts, Europe, Asia, and Africa, all surrounded by water. At the center of this world is Jerusalem and the Mediterranean. It's a conceptual map. It's not really meant to be a geographical map. But people understood in all parts of what would come to be called the Old World that the world was divided into 3 parts. And so the seeming discovery on the part of Columbus of a so-called 4th part of the world, this unknown part of the world, caused an awful lot of confusion, but it gave map makers a big opportunity. There was a whole new need for new maps. I just love this map from 1507 because the map makers just trying to get in the fact that the Cape of Good Hope has just been rounded, and that's going to kind of break down the bottom of Africa. And this new landmass, which is here painted green in this famous German map, which was a giant map. It was wallpaper. It was 12 giant maps that you glued together and pasted on the wall. Only 1 copy survives. He didn't know what to label this new landmass in the middle of this ocean, this 4th part of the world. But he had read Amerigo Vespucci's account of it, and so he labels it America. It's the only thing that really survives from this map. The rest of the map is, of course, quite contorted. But this new land comes to be called America soon after that. Map was made in 1507. And in a lot of European representations, America is figured as she is here as a naked woman. This is Vespucci awakening a sleeping America. Vespucci with his own particular Harvey Weinstein problem. The contempt of Europeans for the primitiveness, but also the admiration for the primitiveness of America as a naked woman, waiting to be raped, essentially, is what this is a picture of. Europeans bringing their technology and their civilization and their religion and especially their technology to these people whose technology consists at its apogee of the hammock. This is what this engraving is meant to tell us. There's a very interesting way that this figuring of America as a naked woman will reemerge in American political life. But there's also a whole tradition of depicting the globe in a new way. This is Queen Elizabeth I resting her hand on a globe, and she is covering North America with her hand. This is this incredible act of aggressive possession, the taking of possession, this making claim, England making its claim at a time when it has no colonies in what's come to be called the New World. And the erasure then of the view of the world that native peoples had. This is a map and also an ornament, a cloak that was worn by the Powhatan leader known as Powhatan, who's Pocahontas' father. It's a cloak. It represents a map of his realm. It's like that TO map. It's an abstract representation of the world. And here's Powhatan at the center with his animal spirits on either side, and the 30-some villages that pay tribute to him surrounding him. This conceptual way of representing the world was actually greatly influenced American map makers, not least of them Benjamin Franklin, who in 1754 represented the mainland colonies that had been settled by the British and claimed by the British urging for a union for the sake of common defense. This is also, people tend to forget, this is a map. North is down here, but we go from New England all the way down to the south. This way of representing the world is greatly influenced by some of those native maps that I just showed you one of. The representation of America as a naked woman comes back again and again during the American Revolution, when England continues to rape America. Here, this is a political cartoon about the coercive acts that closed the port of Boston after the Boston Tea Party. But how the new republic represents itself as a nation is through the Constitution itself. The Constitution as constituting the body of the people, instantiating the people as a body. The body politic represented on a piece of paper that is not a map, but a charter. Chart and charter have the same root. The map and the charter are essentially the same kind of document. This is its own map of now what has been formed and declared its independence as the United States, which would have an incredibly burly political culture, very raucous, partisan, and fractious. It's hard to maybe see from where you're looking at, but the Federalist and Anti-Federalist on this side of your screen are actually peeing and shitting on each other. I just show this thought. This is from 1787, the great year of the framing of the Constitution, just to give us a little bit of a vantage on the long tradition of viciousness in American politics. American politics and American political representation of the problem of America always was inflected too with race. This is an early political satire of Thomas Jefferson, depicted here as a cock with his hen, the woman Sally Hemings, with whom we know now he had 6 children. Race finds its way into representations of America as a nation at a time when Americans are trying to understand what it means to be a nation and who belongs and who doesn't belong. This beautiful painting from 1848 I find very moving. Can you see what's going on here? Does anyone want to shout out? We can hear you. We're on the porch of the American Hotel. So this porch is the nation. This is the national porch. The American eagle is over us. Who's on the porch? Yeah, there's a bunch of white men, a real range of white men. This is the thrill of American democracy. They're wealthy. They're not wealthy. They're somewhat ragged. They're kind of bumptious. Some of them are country guys. Some of them are city guys. This is Jacksonian America. This is the enfranchisement of all white men, regardless of their ownership of property. And in many ways, this celebration of their involvement in their own self-government, they're reading the newspaper to find out what's going on in the war with Mexico and what they think about it, is a real celebration of that extension of the suffrage. But if you can see over to the right of your screen, there's a woman leaning out the window, straining to hear the political conversation that's going on that porch where she is not allowed. And most powerfully of all are these 2 figures in the front, this African-American man with presumably his daughter, who are depicted here, represented as if they must be enslaved, the clothing that they're wearing. And what's so moving to me about this really quite subversive portrait, they're not allowed on the porch. They're off the porch. They're very much in the picture. If anything, they're quite a focus of the picture. And they are the red, white, and blue characters in this picture. It's a really, really interesting representation of the troubled nature of American citizenship in the 19th century. We will also see in the 19th century political maps that are uncannily familiar to those of us who have studied electoral maps of the last few elections. But this convention of representing the country as divided and then coloring in the different parts here, and almost invariably slave states versus free states during the great debates before the Civil War, this way of kind of dividing the country by slave and free, understanding those lines as representing whole political opinions, which of course in the sort of purple notion that we would embrace now, we see is a misrepresentation, but it really contributes to the divisions in American political life. This is maybe my favorite picture of the United States in the 19th century. Can you see what's going on here? This is Sojourner Truth, the former slave and famed abolitionist. She's knitting. She's knitting the country. That is the outline of the United States unfurling in her lap. It's this incredibly powerful claim. I made this country. This is not just a claim to citizenship. This is a claim to kind of maternity, to the making of the nation. I just think it's an incredibly powerful representation of a claim that could easily be missed. It's a sneaky claim. You see, by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, there are no federal laws restricting immigration to the United States until the 1880s. And when those laws begin, they're restricting the Chinese, which is depicted here as a real failure of the American political imagination at a time when we're supposed to be in San Francisco here, when China is dismantling its own Great Wall, and a kind of line of very coarsely represented Americans are building our own wall. The wall as an icon in American political culture goes quite far back. So does the representation of populism as ragtag and somewhat primitive. Here, this is the representation of the patch of populism on the strained American political culture of the late 19th century, where widening income inequality leads to the progressive critique of plutocrats and the tremendous progressive reforms of the 19-teens and 1920s, which will include the emancipation of women, tearing off the bonds here of tyranny and of men's oppression by finally achieving the right to vote. But this is a version of that naked woman, America as a woman, now no longer being raped by Europe, but actually emancipating herself. That image competes, though, with this new representation of mass democracy, here figured as mass production, but which communicates tremendous anxiety about the anonymity, the overwhelming numbers. This is a sort of celebration of production, but it also is an extremely anxious image, I think, about excess, where by the 1920s, the great age of immigration restriction, when the federal government enforces wholly new laws that are extremely controversial at the time, that are influenced by racist ideas, that are an extension of Jim Crow to the scheme of immigration, new imagery that maybe isn't with us at the moment. The image of the funnel, for all we know, could reemerge. But there's a new iconography of representing the way the nation's borders are figured. You get, by the time we get to the Second World War, this new iconography that comes out of pop culture. Mass culture is a new thing by the 1930s, suggesting the United States as a world power, as a superpower. For all their strengths and weaknesses, these superhero comic books actually emphasize human rights. Wonder Woman comes to the United States from Paradise Island to fight for women's rights and equality for women, because the United States is the best hope for women's equality. There's this really interesting rights rhetoric to the superhero popular culture of the 1930s and 1940s, a time after the war when liberalism is really turning to attend to questions of rights. This is, I think, like that Sojourner Truth image, a beautiful image of the nation, the continent, the period representing the great migration of African Americans from the Jim Crow South, especially to cities in the Midwest and in the West. This most important migration in American history in the first half of the 20th century, at a time when the United States is beginning to think about its relationship to the rest of the world differently. Recall that beautiful painting of Queen Elizabeth resting her hand on the globe and claiming North America. And think about that when we look here at the vantage that FDR has on the world in 1942, before the UN Charter, but when he's thinking about the UN Charter, when he's thinking about the United States' role as a leader of the liberal world order, something that also invests America with representations of its particular military strength. So there's a real celebration iconographically in this era of the age of the machine, but no machine, of course, turns out to be more influential than this, the general purpose computer, which is devised by the military in the 1930s and 1940s for the sake of the war, to calculate missile trajectories, but very quickly is adopted in the function of government. The first general purpose computer that sold commercially in 1951 is the Univac, and it sold to the US Census Bureau to count the population really, really fast and to sort the population, to atomize the population in ways that have huge influences for our day. And some of the anxiety of that influence, of the automation of political processes, is depicted here. As early as 1952, you may know, the Univac was used to predict the outcome of the election on election night. It did a really bad job, and Edward R. Murrow was very happy that his prediction came earlier in the evening and he was right and the Univac was wrong. It was the last triumph of man over machine. But there's a lot of commercial energy behind the mainframe computer, and there's also a lot of political energy behind it because of the Cold War. This representation of the United States' relationship to the world, this kind of atlas-like quality. These are supposed to be MIT scientists in the age of Sputnik who are anxiously poring over their computer printouts to make sure that American technology will remain ahead of, or will catch up with, or will always be ahead of Soviet technology. That drive, the Cold War drive of technological development in the 1950s and 1960s, which we especially associate with the military, I think explains to some degree the heedlessness of our embrace of technological solutions to political problems, the recklessness of the pace of our technological change. There are all kinds of responses that we could identify to automation, to this new age of the machine, to the pace of technological change, to people's frustration with being sorted and counted by computers. And there's a whole body of art that has a certain kind of messiness, deliberately messy response to the sorting and the counting and the naming and the numbering. The sorting and the counting and the naming and the numbering of the dead in Vietnam. The ways in which the United States comes to be represented as much by its protests, by its political protests from the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement. This last piece of American history that I'm trying to swiftly take us through, I'm not going to spend much time on, because this era from 1972 to the present, you understand what I think people know in their mind's eye what this photograph meant, the political consequences it had, how it has been used symbolically by the environmental movement, how it has this kind of Newtonian change of perspective consequence, and yet in some ways, of course, doesn't have that consequence at all. When I teach this period, 1968 to the present, I did a terrible shortcut. I actually find this period really, the period of my own lifetime, very difficult to talk about. I just show this slide. Can you see it at all? Let's see if you could see it. What we're looking at here are, it's two graphs imposed upon one another. One, the red graph is charting polarization in the House by as measured by roll call votes, party polarization, and the blue graph is charting inequality of income as measured by the Gini index. And I ask my students, so we begin in 1947 over here on the left, and we're ending in about 2012, and you'll see that both of these metrics are flat right from the end of the war through about 68, 72. And then they've been rising ever since, very closely tracking one another. And this is a question for our Q&A, but this is, I think, a very interesting representation, not only of how social science understands a nation, what economists and political scientists do to measure, and how looking at figures like this shape our understanding of our own world, but also it asks, it implies a question. Why are these two things so closely tracing one another? Is one causing the other? Are we polarized because we're unequal? Are we unequal because we're polar? What is this policy gridlock? Is this the economy? It's a slide that asks a lot of students. So I'm hoping you guys will have answers for us all in the Q&A. But this kind of slow investigation, the careful measuring and collection of data and analysis that this represents as a form of social science was largely cast aside by representations like this. Wired magazine in the year 2000 said that the wiring of America would solve every political division. The United States would no longer suffer from the least political division because of the power of the internet to hold people together. That didn't last, and this notion that the world was in fact so far from being glued together in a new powerful way, was in fact being disrupted by new kinds of political activity, by new forms of warfare, and by new technologies, is really beautifully represented. I don't know if any of you have ever been to see this incredibly beautiful work in the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. It's a giant wall. It's kind of like that Waldseemüller map of the wall. It's just really big. You have to reckon with it. And it's made up, every single state is made up of little television screens that are broadcasting stuff about their state at the top volume. So in Oklahoma, one of the screens is playing Oklahoma. And people are saying, "Oh, Oklahoma!" But someone else is actually trying to describe, like wrestling with a bull. And the closer you get to it, the less you can understand. Far away, it sounds terrible. Close up, it's just loud and terrible. No matter where you go, everybody is talking and no one is listening to one another. It's actually a really beautiful piece of... It's a really, really beautiful piece of art about our contemporary political chaos and the ways in which technology sorts us out, asks us to talk at full volume, and never asks us to listen. This particular kind of political chaos, I think, helps in many ways to understand calls to heritage, feelings that there's a need for a return to simpler times. As an 18th century historian, I think the 18th century was horrible. I don't want to go back to the 18th century, but I think in the mythical way, something about the Tea Party movement, I could see, I could understand and see with regard to an aversion to the chaos, the noise, the huge inequalities and raucousness of contemporary life. I just want to close by suggesting then that so much of the imagery and iconography that manifests itself in our political conversations has very old origins, has been through many iterations. That when we look at an electoral map, this is not something that CNN invented, that it looks this way, that it is used this way, that it asks us to think about ourselves as separate from one another and not as part of a nation, is actually a very long and old story. It's one we should be skeptical of. And I guess I would end with one of the, I think, most beautiful pieces of art that I have seen that have attempted to wrestle with our moment in time. This is this neon work by Glenn Ligon, who has said that he did a whole series of these works that are called Double America, that he really was just thinking about Charles Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. So thank you.
We are going to now turn to questions from all of you. There are microphones there, in the balcony, there, and there. So please begin to line up and we'll start the questions in a minute. Jill has a rule, which we will enforce tonight if it doesn't happen organically, which is after two questions from men, a woman gets to ask a question. After two questions from women, I don't know what the rule is. I guess we just go on from there.
It doesn't happen.
So as you begin to line up, let me pose one question from all of that, which is from the chart you did on the polarization. This country's obviously been through divisive times, difficult times, periods of pushing and tugging from one era to another. Is there something different about this period of polarization than we have had in the past? And if so, what is it? And if not, why do we seem to think it is?
Well, I think in previous eras, much less of the population was enfranchised, so we don't know their political views. right? So if we think about people, if they try to chart political polarization over time using roll call votes in Congress, you get a kind of, sort of things seem to be fairly harmonious until the 1830s, and then all hell breaks out until the 1870s, and then you have a kind of period where things seem to be fair. There's division, but it doesn't. Things don't sort out that well. Then there's another period. It's a kind of ebb and flow. But we're looking at an entire era in which, certainly well after the 15th Amendment, because of the black codes in the South, blacks are disenfranchised. So I find it somewhat cynical to say this is the most polarized the nation has ever been, when we cannot measure the political views of huge portions of the population. To me, that's worse, objectively worse.
Right.
So if we ask, is it better, is it worse, question, which I don't really think is the right question. I mean, I know people want to know the answer to that question. That's worse.
Is it different?
Is it different?
I mean, because we
so
define it now more in terms of political party.
Yeah. So
as opposed to some other types of divisions.
Right. I mean, what political scientists would say when they talk about this sort of big sorting that happened between 68 and really 1980, but 2000, let's say, was that the parties were sorted. People sorted themselves by party, and the parties sorted themselves by ideology. That before that was not the case. And there are some really interesting theories that political scientists offer to explain what's causing that. A lot of them are actually technologically driven, but I think a lot of it frankly has to do with women. But what's happened since then, since 2000, is that sorting is now an automated process. So that is objectively what's different, right? It can't be undone. That machine was built by people between, say, 68 and 2000, mainly by political consultants who had a real interest in getting people really inflamed so that they could get enough people to vote for candidates, so in the short term they could win offices and win state houses and win Senate seats. And in the long term, they could reimagine the party with, their new coalition that they were building over these hot-button emotional issues. I mean, if you think of basically the abortion guns divide is that divide. That's the political work that's done in that era. But now that that's been done, now it's all automated. Now you'd have to break the machine. That's what I think is different.
Yeah. Okay. We'll start here. If before you ask the question, tell us who you are, if you're in the college, what year you are. And please, everybody, remember no long speeches, and make sure that the question ends with a question mark.
Hi, my name is Ray Sell, and I am a member of the public. And I am starting to think that there's a point at which too many voices are heard. And when you get too many voices being heard, you create just happy chaos. So I'm wondering, has there been any analysis of how many voices are heard, and then what that does to societies, as they go and mature through time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that piece of art, the neon art from the Smithsonian Museum of American Art that I showed you, is really essentially making your argument viscerally. It's quite a powerful one. I mean, historically, that's what political parties are for, right? They're to organize people with a shared interest and allow them to speak with one voice so as to maximize their efficiency. They're also to ensure a system in which dissent is tolerated, right? Because dissent can be squashed. So the party system, when it emerged, really started in the 1790s, but didn't kind of fully reach anything like its modern form until, say, the 1820s, aimed to do that. So the question is, are we now in an age of post-party politics? In which case, you would expect just the kind of destabilizing that you are describing and identifying as, what you see at work in the world. So the question, I guess, and the political scientists in the room will have more insight about this, but younger people are the least likely to have a party affiliation at this point. So if the party system is dying, what is replacing it? is hard to see, but there does need to be some way to organize dissent. And interest group politics doesn't work that well that way. For all the people complain about party politics has been a source of incredible political stability in this country, at least.
My name is Eloise. I'm a junior at the college. I was wondering if in your research you found that there was a turning point where social issues became more important, or whether the Founding Fathers dedicated as much time to social issues, or at what point it kind of switched from the economy and healthcare, and I mean, obviously the Founding Fathers weren't debating healthcare.
So what would be an example for you of an 18th century social issue? Women, or even some of the things, eventually included in the Bill of Rights, I would think of as more, less the structure of government itself. I ask you, I'm sorry, I put you on the spot there, because the term doesn't really have a really great kind of translation, I think, into 18th century political discourse. That is not a divide that we would have people talk about in that way. What we would consider to be the great social issues involving family and children, say, or domestic arrangements or sexual arrangements, these are things that were entirely left out of the Constitution, as is often observed, and leave people seeking constitutional remedies for questions involving those matters in with somewhat of a disability, because they're not directly concerned. Because how the framers understood government was that the government was the public sphere in which men entered and acted in public, and these things that happened privately, men just controlled in their private lives. That's why women couldn't, among the reasons that women couldn't vote, right, that they had no public role to play. And decisions that would be made within the household or about the welfare of children would be made by the head of the household, that the government didn't have a role in that. That fight was a lot of the fight that took place in the 19th century, and that brought women as crusaders, the sort of female crusades of the 19th century, to do things like fight for temperance, that there should be religious reform behind, not so much government, because women couldn't really ask the government to do that much, except they asked the government to end slavery, but they asked men to give up drinking, because what affected the welfare of women and children was drunken men who couldn't bring home money, and women couldn't work, and drunken men would beat their wives and their children. So the solution was to say, you should get religion and stop drinking. And that brought women into public activity, which brought them into politics, which then did bring what we would maybe now call social issues into politics in that way. But that's a really long transformation and a really long struggle.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In the balcony.
Good evening, Professor. So, very recently, I remember reading an article.
Tell us who you are.
I'm sorry. Malcolm. I'm a sophomore at the college. I was reading an article in the NPR featuring you, if I can remember correctly. You were describing how our current political polarization ties into our understanding of the past, and how one example of a divergence there would be when the Nixon administration belittled the academic view of history, basically. So what I'm wondering is, I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I think it'll probably help a lot with my own thesis writing in the future and everything.
Yay for you for writing a thesis.
But so how would you reach across that divide? And because I mean, to reach people who sort of reject that academic view of history.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a big part of why I wrote the book. And I say very squarely in the introduction, I'm trying to cross a bridge here, and I think some reviewers are likely to say, she's really mean to liberals too. I'm not easy on anyone in the book in a certain kind of way, especially when we get to sort of recognizable people in contemporary politics. I'm waiting for someone to notice that. But the way that I think about that as a project here is that when I approached the research for this book, I tried to really think about what's missing from academic history that the public thinks should be in there, and are there blind spots that academics have had of my generation that really need to be remedied? And one that I saw and really tried to attend to was the role of religion, and especially of Christian evangelical religion in American political life and the long history of that intervention, which is not something that in my previous work as a historian I have really dealt with. A big critique of academic history is that the academy is largely secular. University professors who write books tend to not be devoutly religious people of any particular faith, and they just don't pay enough attention to the role of religion in American history. And when I was in graduate school, that was objectively true. I remember when I was in graduate school, people were like, oh my God, 1979, Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. Evangelicals are in American politics and they shouldn't be, and that's crossing the wall between the separation of church and state. And that's outrageous. Like, people really exercised about that. People have reasons to be exercised about that. But that evangelicals have been involved in American politics from the start. Like that, evangelicals were really involved in the American Revolution. And historians of religion know that, but political historians maybe haven't been as attentive to that. So I tried in this book to think about, for instance, the ways in which so many amazing historians of religion and historians of American social history have shown, and also historians of abolitionism, have shown how abolitionists, in particular black abolitionists, really kind of sanctified the Declaration of Independence in the 1820s. When, say, David Walker here in Boston, a free black man, gave this lecture and appealed to the colored citizens of the world, the whole thing is kind of a critique of the Declaration of Independence, in which he's just arguing that the notion of equality in the Declaration of Independence has got to be the notion of equality in Christianity, in which we are all equal before God, and that promise has to be realized for the nation to not even just be a complete fraud. That's a really important speech that I don't know people have attended to enough as politics. So that's sort of, I guess that's an example of something I tried to attend to. My aim's not to please. Like, it's not a book that's supposed to make people happy, but it is not a book that takes the easy way out on whose past counts.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm an alum and I now work here at the Kennedy School. My question is, I'm curious about what your opinion is on the discourse around norm erosion that's gone on since Trump's election, and I'm specifically, if you had a take on the sort of thesis of Corey Robin at the City University of New York, and his sort of critique of what he would say is centrist alarmism. I'm curious what you think.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. I know Corey Robin and his work and really respect it. I don't know the piece you're talking about, so I can't respond to that in particular. I'm sorry. I'm like eager to go see what Corey had to say about norm erosion. My own sense is that the discourse of normalization, like, we can't have this person speak because he normalizes hate. That's just can't. That's intolerance. That's a completely undisguised political intolerance. If people want to be politically intolerant, I think they should say, I don't tolerate this political opinion, and not say that we're normalizing something. I'm not persuaded by the use of that rhetoric.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a first-year PhD student in the history department at Harvard. I'm thinking about your comment about more recent history, or your lifetime, basically. And for me, I was thinking about in high school how my history stopped at Vietnam, basically, and there are more courses now in universities that deal with Vietnam and onwards.
Yeah.
I missed that, unfortunately, but I'm wondering if you think it would be instructive for people to be learning more recent history, shallower.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, when I was in high school, our history class adopted the Second World War. And this was in the 1970s, and I think we were really impoverished by having no opportunity to discuss Vietnam as young people. It was really mysterious to us. It was the elephant in the room. It was awfully weird. So I'm kind of distressed to hear that you guys, your generation, didn't really get much further past that. There is a reason for it, though. I think at the moment, like my kids, I have teenagers, their high school classes really end in 1989, maybe 1991. They end with the end of the Cold War, and they kind of end with this Fukuyama end of history nonsense. You know what I mean? Like they have this, ta-da! It's 1991, capitalism won! And you know, that's just as weird as my growing up, like, it's D-Day! Here it is, like, I'm in high school in, whatever, 1982, and like we're celebrating D-Day as the capstone experience of the American story. There's always that lag, but I think it does a disservice to, like, so my kids have never studied 9/11. Like, I have to explain to them, I mean, people in the room, you have to sort of say, do you know what actually happened on 9/11? Like, they don't know, because they've never learned it in school, and they were too young, they weren't, they're babies when that happened. But the reason that historians are reticent to write textbooks, say, that go up to the near present, is it's very difficult to teach. And it becomes more difficult to teach the more partisan the country becomes. So I think that actually got really exacerbated with Vietnam. Because to teach Vietnam in the 1980s was probably to be somebody who either fought or dodged the draft. And to be in a position of intellectual authority over young people, having that conversation, and to do it honestly, and to have an open and fully open political historical conversation that was going to be about something that was so painfully divisive, is complicated. So when I, for instance, planned this book, I had your instinct, like, it would be good if people could get a little bit nearer. So I was going to end with Barack Obama's inauguration. And I was going to rely on Jim Kloppenberg's magnificent Reading Obama book for my interpretation of Barack Obama as a political figure. And it was just going to be like a ta-da! Like, whether you voted for Obama or liked him or not, like, it's a great ending, right? The inauguration was a really exciting moment, and it takes us to a sense of conclusion. And then Trump won the election when I was in the middle of working on the book. And I thought, well, comfortably as a historian, I don't know what the election of 2016 was about. I don't want to write about that election. I have no idea. I don't even know what Obama's presidency was really about. Like, the verdict's not in. We don't know which way the wind is blowing. But it seemed to me a betrayal of people who voted for Trump in that political revolution to not, what, am I just going to pretend that didn't happen? Like, the book's going to come out in 2018, so the book ends on Election Day in 2016. And I it was really awkward to do. Like, historians we don't. It gives you the heebie-jeebies. Like, you know you're going to be wrong. Like, 2 days later, I was working on the chapter, and I had like something about how Facebook revealed that Cambridge Analytica had 50 million users data, and then like I sent it into the public, and then like 3 weeks later, the like proofread pieces come back, and I'm like, Facebook reveals that 87 million users had the Cambridge Analytica data. Goes into galleys, comes out, and goes, Facebook reveals it does not know how many users. There was no keeping up with it. And I was just trying to get to the election. So I'm sorry, I give you it's a very provocative question. I think it's hard. It's hard, but I think it is also necessary. It's painful for historians to step onto a stage and try to talk about something that happened 2 years ago. It feels like a violation of all of our rules.
See, that's the difference between historians and journalists. We just plunge in and pretend we really know what happened.
That's right. Thank God for journalists.
and then we leave it to you all. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Shota. I'm a master's student here. And my question is, first of all, I'll try to explain the curves that you were talking about.
Oh, great, yeah.
I think it has to do with the decline of American economic soft power, which is decline of small businesses. And I would put two downward racing curves. First, decline in antitrust, which is in anti-monopoly enforcements. Mm-hmm. And second, in the decline of small banks that usually inject money into small businesses. But my question is...
Okay, great. I'll bring you into my lecture class next year.
But my question is, could you explain to us again the difference between political consultants and party bosses and how that may have contributed to monopolies?
Between political consultants and...
political party bosses.
Party bosses. Yeah, so party bosses have been brought to heel in some ways. So the great work of the progressive era was to fight the political machine of the 19th century, to say, this is corrupt. These people are buying votes, they're buying voters, they're getting people drunk and dragging them to the polls. Like, we need a bunch of reforms. And the party machine was largely contained. Some of its greater excesses were contained by progressive era reforms. the sort of backroom smoke. Not that we don't have party bosses now that still are up to all kinds of shenanigans, but the kind of wide-scale voter fraud that was endemic in 19th century elections, especially local elections, just that was really addressed significantly. Political consulting starts almost immediately after those reforms take place. In 1933, the first political consulting firm is founded in California. It's called Campaigns, Inc., and all political consulting derives, like the mothership. And yet, it operated for a full 2 decades before anyone even kind of noticed what they were doing and wrote about it. This incredible reporter for The Nation, Carrie McWilliams, who goes on to be an editor of The Nation, the founders of this political consulting company are Clem Whitaker and Leon Baxter, and he writes this 3-part piece called Government by Whitaker and Baxter in 1951. He's like, actually, I don't know if anyone's noticed this, but these political consultants are running the country now. It's kind of a great intervention of muckraking, but it doesn't pick up all this. There's just not a lot of political reform energy in 1951 around attacking political, because there's a lot of money to be made in it. California is like kind of leading the way with that. This emerging conservative movement in California is just pulling in money and using it to hire political consultants. We still don't even have political consultants to this day are celebrities. They're not villains in our narrative. I mean, I guess Manafort or whatever. Like, there's a, but like, remember when like James Carville and Dick Morris were like the hot guys in town or something? Like they were like, you would want to hear what they had to say. I mean, I don't, people, I'm sorry, still too probably want to hear what some of these people have to say. I don't want to hear what they have to say. But we don't view them the way people talked about Boss Tweed. You know, the kind of, why would you give this person such disproportionate political power? We don't have that. We're very happy to talk about, big money or dark money or campaign spending problems. We don't actually talk about those individuals.
And that industry is so much larger.
So much.
What they were doing is quaint compared to what goes on today. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Diawe, and I am a graduate of the Ed School. I loved every picture in your slideshow, by the way. But I want to know, can you talk more about how you accounted for the erasure of history in your book?
Yeah, I talk a lot about the asymmetry of the historical record and say that, one way people let themselves off the hook of telling a kind of bigger story that includes more people is saying, well, we don't know enough about those people. And that was true for a long time. But in the last half century, this incredible revolution of historical scholarship has happened, where social historians in particular, but family historians, women's historians, people who do African American history, African American studies, ethnic studies, LGBTQ studies, like uncovered this just incredible archival record, and we now have this just libraries full of research into the lives of many other kinds of people. I'm just thinking back to Dan's original kind of framing remark. There's now no longer any excuse to write a history that has the history of the powerful, but there's a political investment in doing so, I guess, is the simple answer to your question. I mean, W.B. Du Bois wrote this essay decades and decades ago called The Propaganda of History, which makes kind of the best claim for how this comes to happen and what its consequences are. But it certainly remains the case, and that it's partly why we have our notion of American history is just as polarized as our notion of the American present, which I think is quite dangerous.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Victoria, and I'm a junior at the college studying history. My question has a bit to do with what you were saying earlier about Vietnam. When we saw the graph of party polarization, there's a peak there for obvious reasons, and I was wondering if you think there's been a shift in the way politicians talk about war and how that has influenced party polarization.
Do you have a thesis there you want to put forward to us?
I guess broad level thesis, there were always pacifists in earlier wars, World War I and World War II, but often people remained united when the war actually started and put all efforts behind the war effort. But obviously that's not the case in Vietnam, and even in current wars we're still in. Yeah.
It's a pretty big question to unfurl. I mean, some of the conventional wisdom is that Vietnam people watched it on their living room televisions. in a way that brought the devastation of that war in its immorality to people at home. I think that the other kind of piece of conventional wisdom about the relationship between the wars that we are in now and party politics is that the reverse is the case, right? People don't see those wars. Only the poor fight them. And the people who are ordering people to those wars have never served in the military. I would really recommend to you the work of Andrew Basevich, who teaches at BU, who is a Vietnam War veteran who was a career officer. One of his sons was killed in Iraq, and he's written a whole series of books about American militarism and its effects on American domestic arrangements and on American foreign policy. I think you got a lot of really interesting answers and raise provocative questions for you in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
My name is Noah Sleeper. I have no affiliation with Harvard. You used some very powerful museum exhibits in your presentation, and I'm curious what, if any, role you see museums and archives and other cultural institutions in playing in sort of shaping, if not a common narrative, sort of a base level of historical fact that could maybe lead to a bit of depolarization in the political sphere.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, certainly with historical museums, some of the most contentious moments in the history wars of the 1990s involved museum exhibits, the Enola Gay stuff, for instance. I don't know if you know, or if people are familiar with that story. But sometimes museums and even archives become places where people who want to do partisan political battle find that it is nourishing to their sense of viciousness to do it. So that's one of the reasons that I put this stuff up that comes from museums and that I think is beautiful and I think carries a force and a power and a meaning and a significance that if you occupy a stage like this, it's pretty useful. Like, I'm glad that people liked some of the images. Like, I hope you never forget that Sojourner Truth photograph. I think that is important. I think that work is important. I think it is very, very important for what does hold communities together. I mean, you probably know that in your neighborhood, someone does something beautiful, it can really change your neighborhood. The same thing is true in a country. So I care about that, and I did this interview yesterday, we were talking earlier, I did a morning edition, which was about the 1930s projects by writers and artists to defend democracy on the radio, with radio plays, a lot of which were funded by the federal government because all the writers and artists were out of work in the Depression. But there was a series of quite amazing radio adaptations of what were essentially American history textbooks. One's called The Epic of America, one was called Americans All, Immigrants All, and then there was this one episode celebration of the Bill of Rights called We Hold These Truths that I talked about on NPR. And when I listened to all of those things, I listened to a ton of 1930s radio, because I was really curious how that works. Like in our moment, what we do when we're mad about the state of affairs is we get angry and we blame people, and we send out, these sort of blame-seeking missiles. But these programs were sort of like take responsibility for the situation efforts. And I wonder why there isn't more of that, but I do think that artists do that, and we just aren't paying enough attention.
Hello. My name's Iman Ali. I'm a master's student at the university, and I'm also from Kentucky. And don't get me wrong, I do love my state, but after moving to Massachusetts, I've definitely been in a different political atmosphere. So the concept of polarization is really interesting to me. And you had a slide that mentioned in 2000 that political scientists believed that the concept of wiring and the internet was going to decrease polarization. However, there were some comments in the back that were like, oh my gosh, that wasn't true at all. And I personally believe that it's led to hyperpolarization, if anything. And so I guess my question first is that why do you think that that statement was made? Because I feel, was so incorrect. Like, what was the basis of it? And then second, is there any kind of trend or study that you feel right now is very popular among certain political scientists that you personally do not agree with, be it about polarization or your field of study?
Okay. Thank you. That is a very rich pair of questions. I like the way you snuck in the second one. With regard to the first, just to be clear, when I show the slide of Wired magazine, which is this kind of like punk We Love the Internet magazine that's still around, it wasn't political scientists who predicted that the internet would save American politics. It was people who wanted the internet to not be subject to government regulation. And that happened in 1996, chiefly through the Telecommunications Act, which is the implementation of essentially a libertarian agenda. There were people who wanted to overthrow the regime that had been established in the 1920s under the first Federal Radio Act of 1927, which said, if you're going to get a license from the government to send out over what was then the wireless information, you have an obligation to the public interest. We're going to care about what you're doing. And then from there had emerged a series of regulations, including the Fairness Doctrine, that said if you're covering politics, you need to show more than one side. That's just the federal government is going to control the airwaves. And then that extended into television. And by the 1950s, conservatives began to say, that's bad for conservatives because when the people who control the television stations and the radio stations say, we want to show more than one side, they're just showing two faces of liberalism. They're not actually allowing conservatives to have a voice. And so they began campaigning to first abolish the Fairness Doctrine, which finally happened in the Reagan administration in 1987, and opened up the way for cable television and talk radio and Rush Limbaugh and MSNBC and the hyper-partisan cable and talk radio world. And that's the world that the people who were advocating for the Telecommunications Act, which is the first big revision of that thing that set up the federal government's interest in the radio, liked. They liked the idea that it was all about just ratings. We'll just let whoever comes, the more people you can get, it's going to be lawless. We do not believe in government regulation of communications in any way, and we want this internet to be completely open. They wrote this Magna Carta. They did a lot to argue for, and they met with a lot of success because the new Democrats of the 1990s, like Al Gore and Bill Clinton, they just thought that the microchip would save humanity, and they signed on to that legislation. That's why we have the internet that we have. It's not like the internet is just some mold that grew in your kitchen. It's like people built it, and they built it because they wanted politics to look this way. This is what they wanted. So they said this is going to make us all kumbaya, that's going to be a nice thing, but they wanted it to be lawless. And their theory of how that's what their libertarian theory was, that would also be beautiful. It hasn't worked out that way. So that's what each of these slides, I've written a 1,000-page book. Each of these slides has a pretty significant thesis behind it. I'm just giving you a sketch. Now I forgot what your second question is, so we're going to have to move on. It was too hard.
I'm afraid we're not going to get to everybody, but
right.
You've been standing for a long while. You get the last question.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your time. My name is Stevie, and I'm an MPP student here at the Kennedy School. And before I came to the Kennedy School, I was a high school English teacher, and we would read out of the New Yorker regularly, and your articles would, when we were lucky enough, would be part of our discussions in class, so thank you. In that vein, if you could assign required reading to American voters in the next 50 days, what would be your suggestion? Besides your book, of course.
Yeah, obviously. Jeez. You mean,
Students don't always do their reading, but you can assign it.
Yeah, I am trying to think of a poem. You kind of need to haiku it. Dan, why'd you go to this question? I just got out of that one.
This is called Stump the Professor.
I know this is hard, but I'm going to say Federalist number 1.
All right. Federalism number 1.
Federalist number 1. Yeah.
Federalist number 1. Professor Lepore, thank you. This exceeded expectations, which were very high. Please give her a round of applause. The book is not published until next week, but if you walk up the street a few blocks, there are copies. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Hi. Well, hey, that was nice. Oh, what a pleasure. Mark, Aaron, nice